Whoever's doing the recording, just let me know when you want me to go.
You're ready to go.
Okay, great. I am calling to order the special meeting of the Marin Municipal Board of Directors for Wednesday, January 13th, 2021. And apparently we are looking for a roll call.
Director Bragman.
Here.
Oh, thank you. Director Gibson.
Aye, here.
Director Russell. I don't see Director Russell. Is he waving his hand? Okay, Director Schmidt.
Present.
And President Kohler.
I'm here. Thank you, everybody. We are now moving on to adopting the agenda for today. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Approval. Second.
Roll call vote, please.
Director Bragman.
Aye.
Director Gibson.
Aye.
Director Schmidt.
Aye.
And President Kohler.
Aye. That moves us to the calendar, and the item for today is the 10-year financial plan.
So Lucy's gonna go ahead and call up our screen.
All right. Can I just stop? I think that we wanted to, it doesn't say on the agenda, but don't we usually have a moment for public comment on items that are not agendized? Oh, I just want to make sure we cover that. Do we have any?
We did not have that. I'm sorry, President Kohler. We sometimes do on special board meetings. We did not have that on this agenda. There is public comment on the agenda item if there are participants for that purpose.
Okay, all right. That's unusual, but all right. I guess we'll just move on to the agendized item.
Hello, it's listed after the presentation.
That's for comments on the agendized item. I was talking about
Oh.
our usual practice
Yeah.
of comments that are not agendized.
Sorry.
So I guess we're not doing that today, so we'll just move on to the agendized item.
Can everyone see that?
Yep, we're looking good.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to start with a brief recap on the project. So the goal of our 10-year financial plan will be to provide strategic and thoughtful approaches to future investments in our system using strategic communications and community engagement to inform the process. The long-range plan will look at both CIP and operational needs, and the process will be guided by the board and informed by what we learn through community engagement. We'll examine a range of levels of investment, and scenarios will be developed for major asset classes and operating programs. Then we'll take those scenarios and evaluate them against our resources and develop a thoughtful, prioritized approach. So I mentioned community engagement is designed to be part of the process. And our goal here is to provide opportunities for engagement that are valuable and informative to both the community and the district that will help inform and at the same time, it builds greater trust and credibility and really illustrates the district's commitment to community engagement and to participation in general from the public. So we've been working with Melissa and her team at Raftellus on a community engagement plan. And what we have here is a high-level look at some of the components of that plan. On the communication side, some of our platforms include our customer newsletter, which is distributed in bills and online, as well as information that's already going out in that newsletter. We've created a new landing page on our website, and that will serve as a primary engagement tool and a hub for our information and materials. Social media, of course, is a key platform for us, as well as traditional media, and that includes things like news releases, editorial board meetings, op-eds, and things of that nature. We also want to tap into some of our stakeholders' channels at other agencies, and we're working on video messaging as well. On the outreach and engagement side, we're looking at working with our community partners and finding ways to bring them into the conversation. So these board workshops are another great way for the community to participate. And we're working on ways to increase attendance and participation in subsequent workshops as well. We're also working on a virtual open house where we can weave in small breakout groups and discussions around key topics of interest. And this approach is really designed to encourage greater levels of engagement at a time when we're seeing Zoom fatigue. Social media is listed here again. But in this case, we're looking at it not just as a portal to share information, but also as an engagement tool, perhaps using polls and other engagement tools that are already built into the platforms. And so part of our strategy here is about going where people are already gathering. And along those lines, we're looking for engagement opportunities through our community partners. And these range from Rotaries and chambers to environmental groups to the conservation and parks community. And finally, some personal and direct engagement opportunities for us will center on phone calls and direct emails. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Jeannie. Just by way of introduction, I'm Melissa Elliott. I'm with the consultant firm Raftellus, who's helping the district with this project today. And, you know, look, we kicked off a lot of work at Marin Water last month, and I'd like to go through our agenda today, touch on what my role as your workshop facilitator is, and then talk you through the series of workshops that staff has laid out for you. We'll probably be doing this in front of each of the workshops because we anticipate additional members of the community may come in and dive into one workshop or another. We want to keep everybody on the same page as to what the work is ahead of us. So we're in workshop 1B, which is building blocks. And as you can see, we'll be progressing through 3 additional workshops that all build on each other that I'll detail in a moment. So the workshops have all been designed to ensure we hear from you. It's critical that staff get direction from the board. And what we saw last month and again today and in the following workshops is that staff is really focused on providing the board with a look at the whole water system, and they will reference what we know today about the system as status quo performance. And you can think of that as the current state, what we know to be true about all of our asset classes and operating programs, and staff's recommendations on how to invest in the water system over the next 10 years. So the financial plan is akin to building a roadmap that has scenarios built in to guide your future decisions. And key in that is prioritizing the investments and operating programs. And part of my role here is to help us prioritize, to have discussions that are productive, to help your staff and consultants produce a 10-year financial plan that will be a useful guide for decisions in the future. And we're going to spend a lot of time up front doing that, but it will save you time at the back end. So we have a 3-hour window of time today. Ben told me very specifically, we don't have to go 3 hours. We want this to be kind of organic with the board helping us with the discussion. So part of my role today is to keep us moving forward. And in virtual settings in particular, we know it's important to end on time because you all probably have another Zoom call to jump on. So I may on occasion ask that we cut off discussion on a topic. Just know I'm just trying to move us forward in our agenda to make sure we cover all the materials. So let's take a look at where we're at in our series of workshops on the next slide. Last month, we showed you the baseline status of 3 areas: storage tanks, water supply, and treatment plants. And we also introduced the concept of status quo and of moving up to different levels of investment, C, B, and A. And on the next slide, we really did hear some great input from the board last month. There was interest in hearing more about operational investments. How do we best understand the operating needs in addition to capital needs? And this discussion centered a lot on conservation in particular, but with the 3 areas we focused on, there wasn't as much operational program information presented. You'll see today that there is more. And also several board members wanted us to hear a little bit more about some of the additional operational investments. I know that staff has been scheduling and will be scheduling deeper dives into these topics to make sure that, especially on conservation, you're looped in and you're getting your questions answered. So next, on a level of investment, directors said that understanding the context of the status quo C, B, and A rating was really important for them. And while specific costs were not provided last month, for the 3 assets we focused on, those levels were C was 1.5 times the status quo, B was 2 times the status quo, and A was 3 times those current levels of investment. And rating criteria was provided in terms of how the current state of assets within the class compared to industry standards. And in most cases, we heard that the current state of assets is below the industry standards. And that's really for a variety of reasons, but primarily because Marin Water is the oldest municipal water district in the entire state of California. And because the district's age, and frankly, it's a really complicated water system. So maintenance is definitely occurring, but those updates and modernization is what needs to be happening to invest into a secure water system. So specific project requests, there were lots of ideas for follow-ups from board members on various projects that were discussed in each asset class. For example, on storage tanks, we heard about the idea of using solar on the tanks. There were suggestions about prioritizing conservation. There were requests for an update on a groundwater study and ideas of how to use neighboring utility information or peer utility information in our analysis. We also heard mentions of positioning Marin Water for success should federal or state funding become available by developing a suite of programs that could be funded together. And again, on those specific requests for information, staff is really tracking those and working to get you the information you asked for. So generally, I would say that feedback was positive from directors. We heard that now is the time to develop a holistic plan, one that will evolve with the district, but one that will provide a roadmap that prioritizes investments and against which new requests for funding can be evaluated. And from one board member, he kind of summed it up as he was encouraging staff to think about this in terms of quantum leaps. How do we leap forward instead of just nibbling around the edges moving forward? So on the next slide, let's talk about today. And we'll be finishing those building blocks of the financial plan, focusing on pipelines, pump stations, your watershed and facilities and capital equipment. And similar to last month, after each of these capital assets, we'll have a really short time for some Q&A just to make sure we're all grounded in the same understanding of the facts that are presented. So we're moving fairly quickly through those Q&A sessions. But after our capital assets, if we stay on track, I've got 10 minutes, a 10-minute break built into this 3-hour agenda. Just because I think we'll all need to get up and stretch a little bit. But we'll be diving back into operating program details. And then following that, we're going to have an introduction to the financial model itself. This is going to be your first look at what things cost, which I know you really want to see. So let's just briefly look at the next 3 workshops. Coming next to you in workshop number 2, we'll be following on this groundwork from 1A and 1B. We'll focus on scenario development. We intend to bring you a range of scenarios for capital and operating investments. You'll be seeing today that we are very purposely not really talking about costs to the end, and we'll be getting your feedback there. So workshop 2 is where we'll be building those scenarios out based on your input, and we'll definitely have those costs attached. So on the next slide, in workshop 3, we'll be using your input to answer your questions and address the concerns we expect you to express in the previous workshop. And at this point, you'll also be seeing some of the work your communications team is bringing to you, as Jeannie mentioned. They'll have been going out, engaging with stakeholders in the community and bringing that back and weaving it into the process so we can see that input coming into these financial scenarios. On the financial side, we'll be working with your staff to update the financial model so we can better show you how those scenarios play out. And then finally, our last session with you, which we are targeting for about June timeframe, we're focused on coming to consensus about our roadmap and the stops we'll be making along the way. We'll be sure to close the loop on any outstanding issues that we have, but most important, we're going to be actually presenting that 10-year financial plan. We'll be demonstrating how we use the input that your community provided us to help shape it. And this is intended really to be a visionary thing, but it's also supposed to be very implementable. It's a working document that's going to guide you and something you can reference in the future for addressing system needs over the next 10 years. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Bond.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning, board members. Mike Bond, Director of Engineering, and I'm pleased to kick off our presentation on the 10-year capital plan for fiscal years ending 2024 through 2033. As we look forward to our capital plan, we wanted to just spend a moment looking back and talking with you about where we've been. So the graph in front of you is a presentation of our actual cash investments in our capital program over the last 10 years. So if you look to the far left, in fiscal year 2012, we invested $14 million in our capital program. And then in the subsequent fiscal years, the amounts varied, but all hovered around $20 million per year. If you move to the right and you see last fiscal year 2020, we invested about 15 million. This is versus a budget of 22 million. So that leaves about $7 million that we're able to invest in this fiscal year. So our current budget for this fiscal year is 22 million, but we estimate that our actual expenditure, our actual investment will be closer to 29 million, given some of the major capital projects that we're undertaking, including the San Geronimo Treatment Plant Emergency Generator Project, the Ross Reservoir Landslide Repair Project, and also about 9 million in pipeline replacement projects. But overall, what we're seeing here is an annual investment of about $20 million per year. And when we talk about the status quo going forward, this is the level of investment we're talking about, continuing around $20 million per year. Next slide, please. As Melissa mentioned, as we go through the different asset classes, we'll be talking about 4 different investment levels. Status quo, of course, is our current investment level. Moving up from there, we go to Group C, which is status quo plus increased investment in areas such as projects that prioritize risk, safety, wildfire equipment, and structure hardening, and also additional projects that get us closer to 50 to 70% of industry standards for renewal and replacement in various asset classes. Moving up the table to the next group, which is Group B. Group B projects get us closer to 70 to 90% of industry standards in various asset classes, and also focus on deferred watershed maintenance and veg management projects. And then finally, at the highest investment level, Group A, we're getting closer to 100% of industry standards in the various asset classes. And we're also able to address taste and odor issues at our water treatment plants. So at the first workshop, Workshop 1A, back on December 17th, we covered storage tanks, water supply, and treatment plants. We wanted to just briefly review one of the aspects of that presentation and also use it to illustrate how the different investment levels impact what we're able to do. So one of the asset classes we talked about was our welded steel tanks. We have 73 welded steel tanks in our system, and they're an important component of our finished water storage system. In order for us to get the useful life out of our welded steel storage tanks, we need to recoat them on an interval of about every 20 to 25 years to protect the steel. So we currently have about 19 tanks in our system that are overdue for recoating. And just to give you a frame of reference, the cost to recoat a 1 million gallon storage tank is about $1 million. So if you look at this graph on the far left, what we show is at the end of the 10-year period, at the end of fiscal year 2033, if we stay with the status quo investment level, the backlog of welded steel storage tanks that need a recoating will increase from 19 to 36. But if we move up to level C, we're able to knock that backlog down to 29, and then all the way up to level A at the end of 2033, we would reduce that backlog of welded steel storage tanks that need recoating down to 7. And one of the aspects of staying on top of our recoating program is that it allows recoating projects to stay minor and not become a major rehabilitation project. So one of the projects that we're undertaking right now is a rehabilitation project for our Smith saddle tanks, which are shown here on the left. These 2 tanks were built in the early 1960s and provide about 10 million gallons of storage for our water system and are really an important component. About half the water in our system travels through our Smith saddle storage tanks. And both the interior and exterior coatings for these tanks have reached the end of their useful life and they need to be recoated. On the right, you see photographs from the interior of these tanks showing the tank roof and the tank wall, and you can see the corrosion that, if left unattended, could become a significant rehabilitation project. So we're looking forward to bringing more information about this project later this spring. So today, the infrastructure assets that we're covering are pipelines, which will be led by Alicia Irish. Watershed will be led by Sean Horn. And then I will present regarding facilities and capital equipment. And then finally, our pump station assets will be led by Alicia Irish. And at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to Alicia.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, directors. This morning, I'll be talking to you about pipelines. So over the next 10 years at the status quo investment level, we'll be able to replace 70 miles of pipeline, as well as replace 2,000 of our plastic services. Moving up to investment level C, we'll be able to do everything in the status quo, as well as replace an additional 10 miles of pipeline and replace 50% of the plastic services. At the next investment level, level B, we'll be able to do everything in level C, as well as replace an additional 10 miles of pipeline and replace 75% of the plastic services in our system. At the highest investment level, level A, we'll be able to do everything in level B, as well as replace an additional 10 miles of pipeline, replace all of the plastic services in our system, as well as be able to perform 3 major transmission pipeline projects. So when thinking about pipeline replacement, this can be translated into overall system replacement. So at the status quo investment level, replacing 7 miles of pipeline a year, it would take 129 years to replace our entire system. This number decreases as our investment level increases, all the way to investment level A, replacing 10 miles of pipeline a year, where it would only take 90 years to replace our entire system. So of the 900 miles of pipeline that we have, the current average age of our pipeline is 47 years. These 900 miles are comprised of 34%, or roughly 1/3 cast iron, 44%, or a little less than 1/2 welded steel. And then we have 3 other pipeline groupings, each comprising a little less than 10% of our total system, respectively. These pipeline groups are PVC and HDPE, asbestos cement and galvanized threaded pipe, as well as other pipe, which is comprised of concrete pipe, brass, copper, corrugated metal, ductile iron, various steel pipes, plastic, and unknown. The colors on the bars that you see in the chart represent these various pipeline groups. And the blue portion on the upper part of most of these bars represents the welded steel in our system. And you can see that the majority of the welded steel was installed after the 1950s. The yellow portion in the middle of most of these bars represents the cast iron in our system. And you can see that the majority of the cast iron was installed prior to the 1970s. The other thing to note on this chart is just the vast age and legacy of our system. And I'll be talking about on an upcoming slide, the importance of prioritizing our pipeline projects over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. One last thing to note on this chart is that about 1/3 of our system was installed in the 1950s and 1960s, with the vast majority of this being cast iron pipe. The photo on the left shows a pipeline from this era, a 65-year-old cast iron pipe installed in Fairfax. And you can see in this photo that this pipeline failed prior to its expected useful life, and that it had a huge main break in 2019. So each pipeline material can be assigned an estimated useful life according to industry standards. And when this estimated useful life, next slide please, is applied to the pipelines in our system, you can see in the chart the pipeline estimated replacement year for all 900 miles of pipe. The red line in the center of the chart shows the end of the 10-year plan in 2034. And all of the bars to the left of this red line indicate pipeline that would be overdue for replacement at that time. There are over 100 miles of pipeline to the left of this red line. And in years 2031 and 2032, each of these years will have over 20 miles of pipeline come overdue for replacement during these years respectively. And while some pipes will exceed their estimated useful life and that they will be performing well and exhibit little to no leak history, there will be some pipes that will need to be addressed or replaced prior to the end of this useful life. Next slide, please. So it's not just a matter of the total miles of pipeline to replace, but it's also a matter of picking the right miles of pipeline to replace. Some factors to consider include pipeline material, such as problematic cast iron, pipelines in geohazard areas or areas of liquefaction, consequence of failure or the impact that were to occur if the pipeline were to break, as well as coordination with the cities and jurisdictions in our service area to coordinate street paving work for reduction in customer impacts and costs. So in considering these factors for prioritization, we'll be able to decrease the number of service interruptions to our customers, minimize our water loss, as well as improve our level of service to our customers system-wide. The other component of the 10-year financial plan pipeline asset class is the replacement of plastic services. We currently have about 8,000 total plastic services in our system, and these were primarily installed in the 1970s and 1980s. These plastic services account for 27% of the total leaks in our system over the last 10 years. And in some cases, these plastic services are attached to mainline pipe that is in good working condition and has exhibited little to no leak history. So in some cases, in order to maximize our system reliability, the best use of funding would be to go in and replace these services while not replacing that particular mainline pipe. So with increasing investment levels, we're able to replace more plastic services and replace more miles of pipeline, all the way up to the highest investment level, level A, where we'll be able to perform 3 major transmission pipeline projects. Next slide, please. The first of these projects is the North Marin Line project. The North Marin Line is the sole transmission from Nicasio and Kent Lakes to the San Geronimo treatment plant. If this particular pipeline were to fail, there would be no water feeding the San Geronimo treatment plant, the largest treatment plant in our system. The segment of pipeline highlighted in the photo here shows a 4-mile long stretch of 33-inch concrete pipe installed in 1957. This segment of pipeline has an extensive leak history and has been proven difficult to repair. This segment of pipeline also crosses the Lagunitas Creek in 2 separate locations and is in need of improved seismic reliability. The other 2 transmission pipeline projects we would be able to perform at investment level A are the San Quentin Transmission Bottleneck Project and the Alpine Direct Draw Intake System. The San Quentin project would improve transmission between the north and south parts of our system, add to our system reliability, improve our emergency response contingency, as well as improve our level of service to our customers all throughout our service area. The Alpine Direct Draw Intake System project would provide direct transmission from Alpine to Bontempi treatment plants, bypassing Bontempi Lake. So with increased investment levels, next slide, please, we're able to address increasing amounts of our aging infrastructure, decrease our overall long-term costs, and improve our level of service to our customers. And now I'll be handing this back to Melissa for questions.
Thanks, Alicia. Boy, we heard a lot about level of service to customers. I'd love to hear some questions from board members for Alicia.
This is Larry Russell. I have several questions. I don't understand the logic that's being applied to a replacement interval. If we have more and more steel, welded steel pipe that's cathodically protected, I think it's not rational to say it has a life of 100 years and we're replacing all the pipelines in 100 years. Similarly with plastic, I don't see the logic of categorizing that one in the same kind of issues. It has a life of probably 500 years or something like that. And I think we need to break out of the mold of what I would consider old thinking. The other thing that jumps out at me here is that we need a strategy for avoiding epiphanies. Clearly, they jumped on the plastic laterals. Now, a lot of water districts jump on the plastic laterals, but a lot didn't. And I'd like to know what the plan is to avoid those kind of pitfalls in the future. Maybe we've received an adequate life out of them. You don't mention when they were installed. So it's hard to know what is reasonable for life. With copper, especially if we cathodically protected the copper ones, which we don't currently, but if we did, again, you'd be looking at almost infinite life. I think the other part that is missing here is a evaluation of our corrosion protection plan. I have recently been involved in depositions in Flint, Michigan, and one of the things that I've observed about Marin Municipal is that my estimate, based on a rough corrosion rate, is that the consumer plumbing here lasts around 400 years. That's based on a 0.1 mil per year rate. In the business, a 1 mil per year rate is a very good rate of corrosion control. We're substantially lower than that. I pay a lot of attention to things that involve consumers plumbing, and I am not aware of a single home in Southern Marin that has required plumbing replacement due to corrosion of its internal plumbing. Comparing that to San Francisco, where I've involved in several projects, 30-year life is not unusual in San Francisco. And like I say, I've been here since '92, and as I say, I pay attention to this kind of stuff, and my database may not be very adequate, but I'm not aware of any. So, and like I say, my observation of the corrosion rates here, including my own personal plumbing, my house was built in '65. The plumbing looks like it's new when you look at the inside of it. So I think we need to add a piece into this, which is the corrosion protection program and its benefit to the community, and the costs that we are saving the community and thereby increasing the value of homes. I did a rough calculation. If you assume that 30-year life is normal, and that means 3% of the homes are being replaced every year, it comes to a value for the corrosion control program, the internal one, the phosphate edition, a value of about $70 million a year that the water district provides. So I think we should open up our looking a little bit and kind of think out of the box here a little bit, instead of just going the conventional way of saying, well, we replace 50 years of pipes or 100 years of pipes, because I think we have two basic pipe types that don't fit that equation at all. I mean, I don't know what you guys think the life of welded steel pipe is, it's cathodically protected, but I would assume it's closing in on infinity if you keep the cathodic protection adequate and in place.
I think those are some very nice points. I do agree with you. I think pipelines, especially newly installed pipelines with good construction practices, do have the ability to extend the useful lives by more than 100 years. However, I do think we need to take into account the vast age and legacy of our system. We have hundreds and hundreds of miles of pipe that is neither welded steel nor PVC and is showing signs of deterioration and will need to be addressed in order to maintain the system reliability throughout our service area. But I do think
Of course, that's the whole point. That's the whole point of what I'm saying, is that the effort should be directed at the cast iron replacement. not at a general number of replacing 100 miles a year or 90 miles a year. That's irrelevant. What's important is addressing the pipes that need to be replaced, and then forget about this idea of what our average replacement interval is, because it's not meaningful. What's meaningful is to get the pipes out that are crap and focus on the ones that getting them up to the current standard. That's the whole point.
So that makes sense, because I was thinking of a similar response that Alicia provided, Director Russell. And really, correct me if I'm wrong, Alicia, but I think within the 10-year plus planning horizon, it's being driven exclusively by cast iron as we think about miles per year.
Correct. Yeah, we have over 300 miles of cast iron in our system. So we have plenty of work to do that will take us long past this 10-year plan.
Well, it takes us long past, Alicia, if that's the approach we use. But if we take a different approach, which is I don't know what the number is, $100 million to replace them all. I'm just guessing. You know, maybe we need to focus on replacing them all.
It's
get
roughly,
it in the past.
And Alicia or Mike may have this, but it's a good number to have. I believe we average maybe $1.5 million per mile.
That's correct.
So 300 miles, right? 450 million.
Okay, well, whatever the number is, the point I'm getting at is maybe we should take a Manhattan Project approach to eliminating them, instead of just saying, well, we're going to take out X miles per year, to say we need to take out 10 times that number the first year, or whatever the number is. But this averaging kind of thing just gets under my skin with respect to a management approach. I understand the logic of it from this kind of presentation, but I don't understand the logic of it from operating a water district.
Understood. And what we'll be bringing at the next workshop is ideas such as you're bringing. What would kind of a accelerated concept look like of hitting cast iron and hitting tanks and those kind of things? And that really is going to be the heart of the discussions going forward, is how do we prioritize? How do we think about resources to invest in different levels of scenarios?
The other thing, Ben, you hit on the tanks. I think we need to rethink our strategy on the tanks as well. I think, you know, one of the problems with bolted steel tanks and steel tanks in general is the problems that Mike discussed, that you set up a recurring maintenance program, that it's a recurrent maintenance need. And it seems to me that the district should give serious consideration to having our own crew of painters and to approach these things on an as available basis, as opposed to going out to bid every time. The other option would be to put out a bid for all the tanks and say, okay, give us an average price per tank or something like that. Sort of the approach of the Golden Gate Bridge. When you finish painting it at one end, you go back to the other end and you start painting again. And you just bite the bullet and recognize that this is an ongoing problem. If we were to do it as the district, and I think our crews are more than capable of doing it, if we were doing it as the district, we'd buy one set of scaffolding, one set of screens, one set of compressors, one set of everything, and then go about tank by tank by tank by tank. And I think we really need to open our eyes there and think about the fact that we have 100 of these tanks, or we're going to have 140 of them. And, you know, we've just started a program that needs to be reviewed, you know, routinely.
So it's a good thought. We'll integrate that into the next workshop when we look at scenarios.
I have a question too, if I can, or half question, half comment. And I hesitate because I can't talk anywhere near the level that Larry just did. So this shows how foolhardy I am. But it seems to all come down to prioritizing the steps forward. And I don't understand why it makes sense to set out the program based on the category of pipe as opposed to, say, geographical area. You know, we have trouble in this location, we have trouble in that location, and those become the steps, not the type of pipe it is. Why would we not take that? I mean, that seems logical to me. What's wrong with that?
Well, I'll take a shot at that, and Alicia or Mike could help as needed. When you say problems, I'm not sure. So there's two types of problems, Director Gibson. One is capacity issues, reliability issues, and you know, she presented a couple of those major transmission projects to address those. On the other hand, pipes, what we do think about it in terms of failures, problems, reliability, likelihood of failures based on the condition and other factors. So I think we do it, and I do feel, based on your question and Director Russell's, that in our effort to present the information maybe in an overly simplistic way, we weren't really able to share the deep dive that goes into all the work and effort as we think about the annual prioritization of our work. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Alicia, Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree with you, Ben. I do think that location is somewhat implicitly taken into account in terms of system reliability. We do try to target areas, or we don't try, we do target areas that exhibit lower reliability or have a higher leak history, or we're experiencing, let's say, property damage based off of recurring leaks. And so we do go into those particular locations and make a point to prioritize those projects in order to have a higher, overall reliability throughout our system. So I would say that location is implicitly taken into account.
Are we ready to move to watersheds?
I have one question on the on Larry Russell's suggestion about sort of creating a painting crew, which I like the suggestion, but just something to look into is, I know Central Marin, or maybe in Ross Valley, was gonna create its own pipe bursting crew because they do a lot of that. And they ended up getting sued because under state law, there's a requirement to bid out some types of work. So it's just an issue that, we would need to kind of clear before we undertook that project, which seems perfectly logical and economical and, efficient. But there is that legal impediment that we're going to need to deal with.
Yeah, this is Monty, Director Schmidt. I would kind of echo some of the ideas that are being put forward here, which is there a cost savings benefit of creating a more dedicated maintenance infrastructure to be able to help us address much of this work that we're talking about in a more cost effective and more timely way? It'd be great to hear if that makes sense, and also Director Bragman's question about whether there are legal implications about contracting that would get in the way of that.
And so I just wanted to know, I'm sorry, Dr. Bragman.
Thanks a lot. The other one that jumps out at me is that North Marin transmission replacement project. I mean, if that goes, our biggest treatment plant goes down. So I'm a little perplexed why that's put in level A as sort of maybe a more remote possibility when it seems to be so central to the capacity and reliability of the system.
I'd say on that, generally, how we put things in the classes was what we looked at it as our initial best effort, not trying to like completely overthink it, but wanting and appreciating comments like you just provided. So as we bring to the next workshop scenarios, we'll be looking at that at different levels. So all of these are different pieces that in the 3 workshops going forward, we'll be moving them around based on the board's input, based on further thinking. I also wanted to note it for the earlier comments, you know, maybe this is self-evident, but a cost of doing this meeting on Zoom like we have to, particularly it's even a bit more tougher with the presentation up. You can't see staff nodding our heads and taking down the comment for discussion that we'll be doing later and bringing it back to the subsequent workshop. So I want to assure you that every single comment is being taken down. And on some, there may be one-offs where we're comfortable responding in the moment. But for the most part, we really are looking for and planning to bring these comments back as to the subsequent workshops.
Sorry, hold on.
All right, I think just in the interest of time, we need to probably move on to Sean and watersheds. So
Yeah,
Sean,
good morning. Yeah, good morning, board members. Sean Horn, Watershed Resource Manager. I'm going to walk you through the different levels of investment and the opportunities we have for the watershed. So we can go on to the next slide. So under the status quo, currently the district is implementing our biodiversity, fires and fuels integrated plan, which is our updated vegetation management plan that was adopted in October of 2019 at a reduced schedule. And at each of these investment levels, we'll look at increasing the implementation of the BFFIP. And then in a future slide, we'll compare each of these levels to our current level of funding for the BFFIP, as well as the plan. We've done a significant amount of work around environmental compliance to get us prepared to address some of our culverts on the watershed. We have over 700 culverts under our jurisdiction. We're currently at the status quo level, implementing 7 to 15 culvert replacement projects a year. In regards to our fire road maintenance, we're conducting we're maintaining 5 to 10% of our system without doing systematic upgrades. In regards to our trail maintenance, we're carrying out routine maintenance on 2 to 5% of our system, with limited upgrades being projects like Azalea Hill, which are primarily being grant funded. And then in regards to our ranger residents, we're conducting our essential repairs to maintain those structures. So moving on to the investment level C on the watershed, we'd be proposing to increase our implementation schedule of the BFFIP by 5%. We'd be accelerating our culvert replacement program, looking at doing 20 to 25 projects a year. We'd be conducting our road maintenance at that higher 10% level with some focused upgrades that we'll speak to in a future slide. And then our trail maintenance, we'd be holding at a 5% system maintenance percentage, with limited upgrades being those grant funded projects. And then also bringing on some additional watershed habitat restoration, really designed to protect and enhance those important biological resources that we're here to steward. At the investment level B, we'd be continuing to increase and stepping up the biodiversity fires and integrated plan by 10%. We'd be looking to do systematic recreational facility improvements and upgrades. Think about parking lots, signs, picnic grounds, and sanitation on the watershed. And we really saw the need for this during this COVID period, where we had an increased level of use and really saw how quickly our facilities can be overwhelmed during high levels of use. We'd be looking at doing some road to trail improvement or conversion projects on some of these redundant roads that are on the watershed. We'd also be looking at increasing our project restore activities, really removing some of those social trails and restoring those areas to enhance the natural resources of the watershed. At the highest level, in level A, we'd be looking to increase the implementation schedule for the BFFIP by 15% from its current level. We'd be looking at additional watershed habitat restoration projects, specifically the West Peak project. We'd also be looking at some historic preservation projects, such as the Alpine Dam blockhouse at the base of the dam, and then also looking to increase our wildfire mitigation projects on the watershed specifically. And this is really above and beyond what we're currently already doing, which is significant, but we'd be looking at some additional facilities that could be placed on the watershed to help with initial attack, as well as some planning endeavors that could help us with evacuation of the watershed during an event or other ways to evaluate how we implement vegetation management from a wildfire management perspective. So moving on, I'm going to go into the Biodiversity, Fires, and Fuels Integrated Plan. The board adopted this new plan to provide guidance to the district on how to manage its watershed lands with a focus on wildfire fuel reduction projects such as forestry restoration to address sudden oak death on the watershed, as well as invasive species management and construction and maintenance of our fuel break system, as well as defensible space around some of the critical infrastructure that we have on the watershed. The plan also outlined management actions and inventories that the district would carry out to protect and enhance those natural resources and the biodiversity of the watershed. You can see that the current rate is the orange line. So that during our last budget cycle, a budget was adopted that had a reduced implementation schedule. And the green line shows what the plan was outlining as far as our implementation schedule. So you can see at each of these different investment levels, we've stepped up our implementation schedule by 5%. What that really does is get us to our target operational funding of $3 million 1 year sooner with each of those investment increases. Now, this is important to point out that this is the one program that you're reviewing that has a combination of capital investment as well as operational funds. So it comes from both of our budget units. In regards to this last year, we were able to meet our BFFIP targets in year 1, but you'll see in year 2 and 3 that that gap will grow between what we have funding for and the actual acre targets that we have. So moving on, I'm going to walk you through each of the levels of investment a little bit more detailed. So on the next slide, we're looking at our investment at level C, which is really increasing the implementation of the BFFIP by that 5%, and then bringing on some really focused watershed restoration projects, specifically Potrero Meadows, looking at moving the fire road that goes through the meadow outside of the meadow footprint to improve the hydrology of that system, as well as address some invasive species within the meadow. Looking at conducting seeps and springs, not only in inventory, but also starting to identify restoration projects along some of our fire roads and other areas that could be enhanced and improved to improve the hydrology. Also looking at kind of next steps in regards to our forest restoration work. So under the BFFIP, we're implementing significant forestry work. We're looking at long-term, how do we maintain and preserve the benefits that the district is investing in those through additional forest restoration actions. Also looking at how we can improve the watershed's biodiversity through creating conservation areas to protect those sensitive resources. And then under this level investment, we'd be looking at improving Sky Oaks Road. So that's really our primary access into the watershed, and it's in need of some upgrades and repairs. We'd also be looking at accelerating our culvert repair projects. That would really be bringing 20 to 25 new projects a year forward to help maintain and preserve the integrity of our roads and trails in the watershed, as well as protect our infrastructure. So at level B, we'd be looking at accelerating the BFFIP by 10% from its current level. We'd be looking at some focused watershed recreation projects, looking at improving sanitation. We saw through the last year during COVID how quickly our existing facilities can be overused. Looking at signage updates watershed-wide to help improve watershed recreation and our visitors' experience broadly. And then looking at doing some rehab to our parking lots, also potentially additional parking in some areas that are already developed. Looking at improving some of our gateway entrances. This could be through additional kiosks, signage, as well as parking areas to really provide access to the watershed lands. And then, as I mentioned, moving forward with a number of projects that were really designed to do trail improvements, whether that be through our Project Restore efforts under our Roads and Trails Management Plan, or removing some of our system roads and downgrading them to different classes of roads or trails, which would reduce the amount of maintenance that we have to do long-term on those systems. Also, one project that's been floated around that we'd be including in this investment level B is to relocate the Bontempe fishing pier. We've recently restored it, but we'd be looking at adding an additional one in a more suitable location for ADA purposes. Now moving on to the investment level A for the watershed. The next slide, please. We'd be looking at accelerating the BFFIP from its current level by 15%. We'd be looking at additional wildfire preparation and mitigation projects. The one that I'd really like to point out is just thinking about doing planning around how we can be more focused with our vegetation management to have the best benefit or the greatest benefit from our investment there, as well as additional planning around how could we evacuate the watershed in an event. Also looking at recreation preservation projects such as the Alpine Dam Blockhouse and conducting and carrying forward that important West Peak restoration project on the top of the mountain. So moving on to the next slide is just a summary of all of these different investment levels that the board can consider and help provide guidance to staff on how we'd like to organize our opportunities in regards to capital investment for the watershed. Really, the kind of focused ones are implementing the biodiversity, fires, and fuels integrated plan and increasing that to an appropriate level. Also looking at increasing our culvert repairs as we go up in those investment scenarios, and bringing on projects that will help us address some of the recreational issues that we have on the watershed, as well as restoring some of our important natural resources. So with that, I'll answer any questions you might have and hand it back over to Melissa.
Questions for Sean?
Sean, this is there's a lot of needs and a lot of different kinds of needs that are trying to be addressed between wildfire and protection of natural resources, wildlife, also maintenance of infrastructure that has impacts on it, like road maintenance and so forth. Can you shed some light on the logic of how you went about prioritizing these different levels? Is it sort of equally a little bit more of each, or does level B or A reflect a higher prioritization of, say, wildfire risk reduction? Could you speak to the logic between these different levels?
Sure. Without going into too much detail, I think one important part of that question is that for all of these different elements, whether it be recreation, wildfire, or natural resource, the district is doing a significant amount of work for each of those. This level of investment is really just being more strategic and focused in certain ones. We went through a prioritization, really looking at kind of the cost and the immediate need for some of these. And so the culverts are one of those things that have a really high need currently, because some of the culverts that we're managing our roads on are old water pipelines, undersized, not functioning. And so that's really an immediate need to not only replace and upgrade those, but also to protect the infrastructure that they're supporting, whether it be the road or access to a critical facility. And then going on to kind of our recreation management and our restoration actions, it wasn't so much balancing one project over the other as much as it was kind of coming up with a prioritization of how we could focus. So a lot of the watershed habitat restoration projects align with our implementation of the biodiversity, fires, and fuels plan. So there are things we're carrying forward, but there's next steps which we don't have funding for, such as implementing some of the restoration actions that we've brought forward here. And then road and trail improvements. These are kind of focused longer term projects, such as doing what we call a road to trail conversion. There are projects that we could leave as roads and it's not going to have an impact. They're fine as they are. However, they do require us to do a higher level of maintenance. So they're not as critical as some of kind of the watershed restoration actions that we're already kind of moving forward through the BFFIP.
That's helpful. I was going to ask a second question, which is in terms of, could you speak to where we're at with the BFFIP and where, I don't want to cast a characterization that's unfair, but it seems like we're behind where the plan had us at. I don't know the history. Being new, I get to claim ignorance. Why we're behind the trajectory of that plan? Yeah. And it's the second piece of the question is, does that, I would be curious to understand what it would take to bring us back up to that plan level, perhaps, whether if that was prioritized, what that would take and how much that would substantially shift sort of the costs based in these different levels.
Yeah, that's a good question. Currently, we are not behind on the BFFIP. We recently adopted it in October of 2019, so we really just completed our first year of implementation, and we're moving into our second year of implementation. In our first year of implementation, we were slightly below what the plan was identifying as our target funding. However, we were able to achieve all of the acres of management per management action that the plan was outlining with that reduced funding, as well as the inventories that were slated for that year one. So we are on track to be consistent with the BFFIP currently. However, in the next year 2, 3, and 4, there is a larger gap in that funding between where our current level is and where the plan was. And we will have a hard time meeting those acreage targets and carrying out all the inventories with that gap. And so that's why we kind of put in small steps to increase and get us closer to meeting the targets of the BFFIP.
Can you say why we're falling behind? I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but why is it that we're falling behind in the next 2 to 3 years?
It's because in the last budget cycle, we adopted a budget that was at a lower threshold than what the plan was outlining.
Okay.
I want to actually support that Monty was just suggesting. I don't think there's anything on our list here that's more important than wildfire protection and the activity we're doing there. And I'm all for improving the parking lots and picnic grounds, et cetera, but it's not on the same level at all so I would give that a much higher priority than pretty much anything else on the list, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Sean, Larry Bragman here. Would it make sense to consider something analogous to what Director Russell suggested about creating some kind of dedicated crew to attack, especially wildfire type, fuel reduction? That's one question. Another question I have is comparing our budget to the surrounding agencies. I don't know if it's an apples to apples comparison, but I'd be interested just to see kind of where we stack up compared to state parks and Marin County open space in adjacent areas. I do agree with Jack's last comment that the wildfire issue obviously is foremost on our minds and on most of our constituents. And in that regard, it would be interesting to find out if there would be some way to partner with the county of Marin in some kind of joint funding through their wildfire tax. So even though we're not paying into the tax directly, it would certainly benefit, a lot of Marin County residents who are, if some of those funds help fund our programs.
Yeah, so to your first question, a dedicated crew, I think we have a strong format in place or model in place where we're bringing on contractors to assist us, which is really helpful for getting the acre targets that we have for each of those management actions, and is appropriate because a lot of the work that we do is seasonal. So it's not as though we would be doing some of this work in a continuous ongoing way just because of the nature of the type of work. So right now, this is the time of year where we're really bringing on and ramping up our contractors to implement the vegetation management. We have 4 different contractors, all with different capabilities and different equipment, conducting work today on the watershed. So I think that model is most appropriate for us to be most efficient with implementing the BFFIP versus bringing on a robust crew. Because I think if we looked at our contractor crews out there today, 4 contractors, all with crew sizes of 3 to 5 people, that would be a significant increase in our staffing on the watershed. And I think we're seeing our ability to implement the BFFIP appropriately with contractors currently. In regards to budgets for surrounding agencies, I don't have all of the details for those budgets, but I can pretty much confidently say that the district is probably doing the most in regards to fuel reduction and restoration work on our watershed and investing above what others are currently. I think the closest one would be Marin County Parks, and I'd be happy to look into that and just kind of bring back a comparison to a watershed committee meeting at a future date. And we are continuing to have conversations with the county about ways to partner on fuel reduction to connect with the new funding that's been available for that kind of work. So we'll continue those conversations as well.
And just one last question, which is, I know that we're part of our BFFIP is to widen some of the existing fire breaks. And, I believe we need to be focusing also on creating defensible space around adjacent neighborhoods. And we've talked about this with Kent Woodlands. There's some neighborhoods in Fairfax, our boundaries really are defensible, and to the extent that we don't have thousands of residential properties, we have, you know, a couple hundred. So I think we need to start really focusing on that, or at least maybe taking a look at that. Because I know we need to protect our capital investment and infrastructure, but I think we also really need to focus on protecting those residential properties that are adjacent, those neighborhoods, both ways, because we can prevent fires from jumping from the neighborhood into the watershed. So that's something I'm interested in, and I know we've discussed it, and I just think that needs to be put on the table for consideration as we go forward.
Yeah, and I will just stress that our fuel break infrastructure does align with where we have residential properties around the watershed. So it exists. A lot of time our fuel break infrastructure looks like a shaded fuel break, so it has that multi-benefit of a fuel break as well as habitat structure to it. But yeah, we're absolutely happy to continue to evaluate and focus resources around those areas in the wildland urban interface and those residential properties.
And could I just ask one more general question quickly? Are we talking about moving some of the budget for watershed maintenance into the capital budget?
So there's always been a capital elements in the capital budget for watershed improvements, specifically around trails, roads, and now more recently, some of our vegetation management budget is also in the capital. It's kind of a split for our biodiversity, fires and fuels plan, half capital, half operational, just generally. So there always has been, and we're continuing that. We're just looking at how we can focus these investments to meet everyone's needs and goals.
Yeah, it's just a little unclear how these tiers are going to be funded, whether it's going to be funded from the watershed fee or if it's going to be funded from some other source. So thanks a lot.
I know we probably should move on, but I want to just flag, and I'm curious first if staff have an idea about how to address this or others. I know that we, in the coming year, there are a number of planning efforts that are underway, Lagunitas Creek Stewardship Plan and a recreation management plans, other things that, you know, for which this 10-year budget would be funding that the implementation of what might come from those planning efforts. In some ways, it would be really nice to maybe complete those before then developing a 10-year budget. So any thoughts about how to, those are carts and horses that may be going, you know, in the wrong order. Any thoughts about how to manage that?
Good point.
I think I'll take a shot at that. I think it's a very good question, a fair question, and something we've struggled with in kicking this off. And I think a way to look at it that works, at least for me, is this is really a foundational planning document that is maybe overused term, but I think it works here. It's a living document. And as we do these planning efforts, and they're going to continue to happen in different ways in different areas, that's going to inform this foundational kind of moving 10-year plan in terms of priorities, in terms of opportunities, and in terms of engagement with the board and the community. So I think it holds together as we go forward. And I just really don't expect, as a kind of progressive agency thinking about the future, there's ever going to be a point in time where we won't have some level of planning work going on.
And with that, thanks, Ben. I think we better turn it to Mike and capital equipment and facilities.
Thank you, Melissa. Let's go to the next slide, please, Lucy. Okay, so with respect to capital equipment and facilities at our status quo investment level, on the facilities end, we're able to continue kind of doing our routine repairs and upgrades to our buildings and facilities. We do want to pursue a project at the admin building to upgrade the electrical equipment so that when we bring a standby mobile power unit to power the building, we're able to power the entire building. The way this 1960 building is configured right now, when we connect a mobile generator to the building, it only powers a handful of offices and outlets. So we'll be pursuing that project at the status quo level. With respect to capital equipment, we're able to, at this level, continue to do our routine replacement of worn out vehicles and heavy equipment, replacement of outdated lab equipment, and then pursue replacement of routine software and hardware upgrades for our computer systems. If we move up to the higher investment level C, with respect to our facilities, at this level, we're able to fund installation of permanent emergency generators at both the administration building and the corporation yard. And then with respect to capital equipment, we're able to replace some watershed safety vehicles, such as the fire truck and the water tender that are shown here. And then most importantly, at this level, we're able to upgrade or replace our enterprise resource planning system, which currently is SAP. And as you know, is reaching the end of its useful life and needs to either be replaced or upgraded. Next slide, please. Continuing on with investment level C. At this level, with respect to the warehouse, which is where we house all of our equipment and our valves and fittings, this 1960 era building, we're able to do some minor upgrades to it. Located within our yard warehouse is our emergency operations center, which is shown here on the right and also doubles as our yard training room. At investment level C, we're able to improve the functionality of our emergency operations center by updating the telephones and computers and monitors and the equipment in this room. At investment level B, with respect to capital equipment, we're able to increase the rate of replacement of our worn vehicles. And then most importantly, we're also able to, with respect to facilities, conduct a major upgrade to the 1960 era warehouse. This warehouse is seismically vulnerable. And at this level, investment level B, we're able to seismically upgrade the building and also kind of do a wholesale improvement at the building to improve its electrical, mechanical equipment and also improve safety in the building. And then we're also able to pursue upgrades to two ranger residents at Sky Oaks and Lake Lagunitas. And then finally, at the highest investment level, level A, with respect to capital equipment, we're able to purchase the equipment and vehicles which are needed to jumpstart our valve exercising program to ensure the functionality of our valves in our system. We're also able to replace the 60-year-old administration building and including the installation of a new emergency operations center, which would be located inside the admin building. So this last table kind of summarizes the different investment levels for our capital equipment and facilities. Starting at the status quo level, we're kind of able to continue doing our routine upgrades to our facilities and replacing the software and hardware. And as we move up the ladder all the way to investment level A, we're able to do some substantial improvements, including replacing our 60-year-old administration building. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the board may have. Are we ready to move on to pump stations?
I guess so.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia Irish, who will finish up the capital section with pump stations.
Thanks, Mike. So over the next 10 years, for our pump station asset class at the status quo investment level, we'll be able to replace 10 major transmission pumps, as well as perform reactive repairs. Moving up to investment level C, we'll be able to do the status quo, as well as rehabilitate 10 pump stations and install 10 permanent generators, in addition to performing structure hardening or wildfire resiliency at 20 of our pump stations. Moving up to investment level B, we'll be able to do everything in investment level C, as well as rehabilitate 10 pump stations, install an additional 10 permanent generators, as well as perform structure hardening at 20 additional pump stations. And at the highest investment level, level A, we'll be able to do everything in investment level C, as well as install a total of 30 permanent generators, perform structure hardening at a total of 64 pump stations, as well as replacing 10 of our most critical pump stations. Next slide, please. So we currently have 95 pump stations in our system with a median age of 53 years. And most of our pump stations have 2 pumps, giving us a total pump count of 178. And these pumps have a median age of 43 years. And when thinking about pump stations, it's a little bit more complex than some of our other asset classes, and that there are just more components to consider. There's not just the pumps, but there's the associated piping, there's the required electrical equipment, there's the building and the roof, and all of these components need to be considered individually as well as on the whole. Some examples of our pump stations include, on the next slide, Fairview Park Pump Station on the left, located in Tam Valley, constructed in 1969, and its single pump installed in 1991. The upper right shows Sausalito Pump House, constructed in 1962, with its pumps installed in 1962 and 1987. And finally, the bottom right shows the Crescent Avenue Pump Station, also in Sausalito, constructed in 1959, and its pumps installed in 1959 and 1962. And while we do have newer pump stations in our system, these 3 provide a good representative view of all 95. And you can see in these photos that in many cases, the spacing and electrical standards are not being met. Another component of the 10-year financial plan pump station asset class is the installation of permanent generators. Installing permanent generators at our pump stations would increase system resiliency, and that these pump stations would be able to seamlessly operate in the event that the primary power source, PG&E, goes offline. The photo on the left shows our fleet of rented portable generators prior to deployment for the PSPS season. And the photo on the right shows one of these generators deployed to our Tam Woods facility pump station and tank site. And while we are moving forward with the purchase of some generators, we do believe that there needs to be a blend of portable available generators as well as installed permanent generators. The third component of the 10-year financial plan pump station asset class is the performance of structural hardening or wildfire resiliency projects at some of our pump stations. This would be done through the utilization of non-combustible materials such as concrete blocks, metal roofs, and screens. The photo on the right shows our newest pump station, Conifer Upper Pump Station, located at the Smith Saddle Tank Site location. This pump station was installed in 2019, and you can see in the photo the use of masonry blocking as well as a metal roof. This can be compared to our Hind Pump Station in San Rafael, installed in 1955, which still utilizes wood siding as well as shingle roofing. At the highest investment level, level A, we're able to not only rehabilitate some pump stations and install permanent generators, as well as performing structure hardening, but we're also able to replace 10 critical pump stations. These pump stations are the real workhorses of the district in that they are responsible for conveying large amounts of water to various parts of our system every day. 3 of these examples include the Federal Works Pump Station in Corte Madera, installed in 1985, the San Quentin Pump Station in San Rafael, installed in 1977, as well as the Phoenix Transfer Pump Station on our watershed, also installed in 1977. So in conclusion, with increasing investment levels, we're able to address increasing amounts of our aging infrastructure, decrease our overall long-term costs, while improving our level of service to our customers. And I'll be happy to take any questions, and I'll pass this back over to Melissa.
Questions for Alicia? Not hearing any. Wow. Alicia and Mike must have covered those last topics so thoroughly as well.
I actually have a question, but it might just be more ignorant. In the places where there are two pumps, is that for capacity or is that for redundancy?
In many of our pump stations, we have both a primary and a standby pump. So for redundancy.
Okay, thank you.
And just, I've got a question. It seems to me, and again, just from a layman's point of view, they are a critical component in the reliability of the system. If a pump goes out, it's like there's no water being delivered versus, well, maybe a pipe will leak or maybe it won't, and we don't really know. So just as far as prioritization, it seems, that these pump stations, are maybe should be rated as a higher priority than pipeline replacement. And the other thing, and I know we're not going to get into, is cost. And, it may be as far as the cost benefit ratio also is very favorable for, raising our investment level in our pump station system. So maybe more of a comment, and I don't know if it prompts any response.
I think it's a good comment in my view, Larry. Really it does reflect the kind of the grappling that staff does as we're thinking about putting together a capital program. And I think that's the richness in this process here, to get that kind of feedback. We go back, we think about it as we develop the scenarios. We look at, okay, how would this change if we raised up pump station that priority? Or maybe we would say, these 4 pump stations, both from age and where they are in the system and how they operate, and then kind of the criticality, the consequence of failure are such, if we took those pump stations and put that up in a higher priority, that kind of thing. And we'll be doing that work in advance of the next workshop, but I appreciate the comment to help us think about that particularly.
Yeah, and just one other thing is just, I'm sure you guys have done it, is just also a cost benefit on permanent versus renting portables. At some point, the line of investment is going to cross. So that's another one of your riddles that you're going to need to be addressing at some point.
So the board on that specifically is going to see, I can't recall if it's this upcoming board meeting or the subsequent one, but we are recommending to purchase a portion of the generators we've been renting annually. And you're absolutely right. The payback is 2 to 3 years, and we have that spelled out in the staff report. So you will be seeing that.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot.
Just but another comment, just it would be really, I'm compelled because of the things that we've been experiencing for the past years about the value of hardening versus prioritizing hardening over other investments in this category. And, particularly, I think understanding if we, what is the cost benefit? If we lose a pump station, it is burned to the ground, we lose everything, versus the cost of hardening. I think understanding that, and especially the places that are in really high risk locations, I'm sure that, at whatever investment level, you folks would obviously prioritize places that are in high risk, but understanding if there is a break point of locations that are really truly in high risk that we really should prioritize in a coming years in order to really accentuate the value or the importance of achieving that. If there's if there's time for one other question, I would actually go back to Michael for a question about capital. Is that if I can quickly just, I feel like there were some really important things, and again, this reflects my ignorance of really of our capital work that is important. So much of what the other presentations have really, I think, highlighted obviously on things that go really to the core of just delivering water to our customers or fire protection, things that stand out as obvious priorities. I honestly don't have an ability to really look at, I know behind the scenes, there's all the great work and importance that, an emergency operations room and other, updates that need to happen. They don't seem as urgent. And I just wonder if there's an ability to put some context of urgency behind these investments, because they obviously are. I just don't understand them.
In terms of,
Let me follow up on that, because that's a question that I've been developing here as well. In our process here for the financial planning, will we have a segment where priority itself is the discussion? Right now, what you're presenting obviously is and a lot of thought has gone behind clearly setting some priorities here that's being presented to us. But will there be a time where the board gets involved in discussing how these priorities were made and why some things are made more of a higher priority than others?
So I'll take a shot at that. The answer is absolutely, because we're hearing the interest of that. We did try to bring the priority and context of C being the highest priority, then B, then A. And we gave illustrative criteria, but we didn't get granular in terms of how did we develop the priority for pump stations or for capital equipment. And then it does become very complicated to talk about kind of across class asset areas. How do we prioritize between a high priority pump and capital equipment and pipe? So anyway, it's a long way of answering. We hear both of these comments, and we will think about that and bring that back next time when we're talking about why we're recommending this scenario and the sort of criteria and thinking about priorities that went into that.
Yeah, well, and I mean specifically things like we don't want to let anything go, but we may have to let some things go just to emphasize those that are of the highest priority.
Right. Right. And I really am appreciating the discussion, because this is hard, and it's hard for staff to do. And I think it takes the engagement, certainly with the board and ultimately with the public, to figure out things like level of service and relative priorities and that sort of stuff. And I wanted to hit one item that Monty, but we could go on forever here, the Emergency Operations Center. Of course, I went through Santa Rosa, so having a center is foremost in my mind. And I think it reflects the difficulty in putting together what you're seeing, putting that as an A, which essentially, right, in our reverse approach is the lower of the priorities of what we're bringing you. Because in all likelihood, tomorrow at a major earthquake, the very small inadequate space we have annexed off the warehouse for an emergency operations center would not be available, because that is not structurally sound. And the criticality of an organization like this having a robust, reliable emergency operations center, I can argue is among the top priorities we have, but I can make the argument for so much of this. So anyway, it's just my way of reflecting that prioritization certainly really at the end of the day is the crux of this entire conversation, and we'll dive deeper into it.
Could I ask one other quick question? Are any of these facilities insured for fire?
I don't know. Does anyone know? I don't know.
It's just.
Can't confirm that, but I would hope that we have property insurance that would address fire as a sort of a primary casualty that's typically insured, but we can definitely.
We do have insurance on the properties. We do not have insurance on the dams.
Okay.
But we have insurance on pump stations, those type of facilities?
Yes.
Sorry.
Before we proceed to the next section, directors, is it okay if we can hear a couple of comments?
Hey,
Public
Terry,
comments?
Terry, we have one more slide. We're not quite done yet.
Oh, well, okay.
Wouldn't
That's
mind.
good.
We're just about finished with the capital section.
Okay, great.
Okay, so we, if we could go, so anyway, this kind of concludes our presentation on the capital facilities. So over the last 2 meetings, we've talked about our 7 asset classes: the pipelines, the storage tanks, pump stations, our treatment plants, watershed, facilities and capital equipment, and water supply. And we wanted to finish today just by giving you a sense of the relative investment level. So what we show here on the 3 columns on the right, the level C, B, and A, is the relative investment level relative to the status quo investment level. So for example, level C, which is the level just above status quo, for the 10-year investment, the total is $110 million above the status quo. At level B, the relative amount is $243 million above the status quo. And then finally, at our highest investment level, level A, that represents an additional investment of over $400 million above the status quo investment level.
I'm sorry, Mike, were you done?
Yes, yes.
Great. So before, Terry, we go to public comments, I have a quick comment, and I apologize that I wasn't able to be at the December meeting. So you may have covered this and I may be behind, but the 7, and this is a super helpful slide, Mike, to have it all summarized this way. So thank you for preparing it. The asset class that seems to be missing is the class that we've talked about for a long time, which is the issue of unconventional decentralized infrastructure that we've been talking about highlighting and moving into our capital plan. It does seem to me that this is the time to have that conversation when we're putting together this 10-year plan. So again, you may have covered this in December, but I'm not hearing anything about what the plan is. And I think I've heard in the past a lot of board agreement about the need to move some of our conservation initiatives into capital and to treat those initiatives that, particularly those that have such high impact for long-term water supply reliability, to treat them as the long-term investments they are and not as annual operating expenses.
Director Kohler, I'll take a cut at a response to that. And in the water supply, and as you noted, I believe you had Warren at that one, we did identify water use efficiency and water conservation in context of distributed infrastructure as part of that asset class. We did get feedbacks from other board members that should be an area we should really think about increased levels of investment. And what staff is planning in next month's, as part of next month's Communication and Conservation Committee, we're going to be spending a good amount of time talking to the board about specifically that. So it just rose up to such a level. We are peeled it off these workshops and plan to dedicate as much time as it takes with the board, looking at our historical level of investment, looking at what we would get for a higher level of investment, and really all trying to understand. And then the outcome of that discussion would be integrated back into the scenarios we bring subsequently.
Perfect, thanks. That's helpful. And again, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there in December.
Sure.
Although I do want to point out that I want to suggest, and maybe this will come into the conversations we have later on, that I'm not sure this all does belong under water supply. There are any number of decentralized strategies that go to treatment, for example, and other, and other kinds of conventional infrastructure strategies. I don't want to belabor that here, but if the idea is that you're going to put all of that under water supply, I just want there to be some flexibility about potentially pulling that out as a class.
Okay.
So I've heard that there's some public comments, and then we're about ready to move to the operating side. I did build in a little bit of a break if the board would like that, but at your direction of whether you'd like to hear public comment at this time.
I think it would be great, Melissa, to hear public comment now, and if we could take a break after that, I think everybody would appreciate it.
Great. I have Roger Roberts.
Welcome, Roger.
My hand and I'm getting my whole space. There, good. A few comments. That last slide is very revealing, but it makes no assessment of what that means relative to water rate structures. And at some point in time, I assume that you're going to address what this all means relative to water rates. I'm very concerned about the relative priorities across all the risk categories and the risk assessments in order to understand which becomes priorities. And I hope that that's going to be part of the process going forward, because that's also going to affect that last slide and ultimately water rates that may or may not be proposed going forward with the public. So those are my initial comments, and I look forward to continuing to participate in your process.
Thank you. The next person is Larry Minikes.
I assume you can hear me now.
Yes.
Good morning, all. Thank you for this presentation. I'd like to say one thing. Instead of grouping these presentations into a large chunk and then getting public feedback, I would ask that you, as you're presenting each piece, ask if there's any public feedback, because there's a lot here to unpack. So it's very difficult to get into specifics at this point. Interesting what Roger Roberts said, because I was going to say the same thing. What I want to see is ABC, and then, well, this is where rates would have to be year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 10, and where we would have to be realistically, so that the public gets an idea of what we're really talking about here, plus where your borrowing power will be in the future. And urgency is really key. You know, it was very interesting to see some of these facilities, but it doesn't say much in terms of what needs, it's inferred, but it doesn't say what needs to be replaced or refurbished. And, you know, when you drive your car and you go over so many miles, it tells you you're so many miles past your oil change. And it would be good to see that, what is the standard for replacing these? Where are we? When should have this been replaced? So we can get an idea of how far past we are our, let's just say, oil change. And it would give all of us a better idea of what the true needs are. You know, just seeing something that's rusty doesn't mean that there's a problem there, but it could also mean that we're way, way past where we should be. And let me speak, I don't know if you're aware of this, I'm chair of the Citizens Oversight Committee for the MWPA. And I'm going to speak not in that capacity at all. I just wanted you to be aware of this, because I can speak a bit to Larry Bragman's comment regarding approaching the MWPA to see if there's any funding there. And because the water district is not part of the MWPA, I don't see how that's going to be possible at all, because there's a lot of priorities right there right now. And I'm going to encourage the Oversight Committee in some way to interface as much as possible with the watershed, because it's such a major part of Marin. And we should be coordinating, but I, you know, speak to the MWPA board. I don't see how there's going to be any financial benefit to the watershed in this particular matter. With that, I thank you very much and bring it back to you.
Hey, Larry, this is Larry Russell. I have a question for you. How about we open up the next workshop with a question and answer period for the public so that you've had some time to digest this information? What if we set aside 40 minutes or an hour or something to deal with questions from the previous presentation? Would that help?
Certainly, I was a little disappointed that we didn't have open time in the beginning. I almost raised my hand. I was listening to Cynthia. I think it would help because I did have comments from last time, and specifically to comment that you made, Larry, about using Rust-Oleum on one of the tanks. And I really thought about that a lot. And it kind of got under my craw because it's like you're covering up the rust. And these are huge.
Oh, no, Larry, no. Wait. I'm a corrosion engineer. Rust-Oleum is a lot more than that. It has zinc incorporated in the paint. It actually is a form of cathodic protection. It is a very sophisticated utility for that kind of protection. So it isn't that you call it a day. It's that you buy time. It's like the difference between, think of it this way. You get a cut on your hand, and every morning you pick the scab off. Well, that's what is equal to open corrosion, open metal in the atmosphere. But if you put a Band-Aid on it and protect it, then it heals. So the Rust-Oleum is much, much more powerful than that. I wasn't blowing it off as a fix. It was just a interim buying time, rather than saying, oh my, it's all rusted, it looks terrible. Well, why don't we take a little more aggressive approach and send a laborer out there and paint the roof? That's what I was trying to say. Kitty, take a wire brush and knock off the loose rust and paint the roof. So at least you're doing something, huh? Instead of saying, well, we can't afford to do it now. When are we going to afford it? Well, it's 10 years from now. That's what I was after, Larry.
Right. And my response to that is do it once and do it right. And don't throw a coat of, even if Rust-Oleum is good, don't throw a coat of paint on there to put it off. Really focus. If we've got,
that's better than doing nothing.
Right. Well, yeah. If we've got places that haven't been painted since '74, as I recall, one of the large tanks. I mean, it needs to be refurbished properly. And I'd rather see our money go into refurbishing properly. Yeah. Thank you.
I have no further comments, public comments.
Okay, if we'd like to take a break, I'd suggest a 10-minute break, which will bring us back at 10:55 by my watch.
I think that would be great.
That's a great idea.
All right.
Thank you.
Time. This next section is a bit of a shift as we go from capital operating, moving from these asset classes to really a range of identification of needs and opportunities throughout the organization for different reasons and using different criteria. And we'll get into that a little bit. And some of it may be self-evident in a relative way. Some of it may not be. We developed these through a fairly robust effort of the management team and identifying opportunities and trying to come up with a basis for prioritizing. And there were plenty that didn't make the cut to even the level A you'll be seeing. So, and then of course, these will be integrated into the investment scenarios we'll be bringing you in future workshops with the capital as we look at the different levels of investment. And as Roger Roberts commented, how those different investment levels or scenarios translates to revenues that we need and rates. And similar to what we did on the capital assets, of course, very interested in feedback from the board, whether it's trying to understand the reasoning for the priorities of why did this go so high or low, or any other comments or thoughts you may have. So with that, I'll roll into it. So level C, that similar to the asset classes, is the current initial thought of the investments we should make above status quo. So kind of the highest priority. The first one, ranger staff enhancement. Of course, we've been talking about that a fair amount. And that is a way to increase our enforcement and educational profile on the watershed for many, many reasons that we talk about and grapple with. Employee development, this is a similar new staff position, one position. To the way I think about this is to support the most important asset class that we have in the organization, which is our staff. The 240, 250 people, including part-time workers, in thinking about and developing them in terms of training and development and other programs like culture, and that starts at new employee orientation, that we really are, I just say the opportunities there are notable, to supervisory and management training in an ongoing way. A big need for thinking about a technical training program through all areas of the organization that will assist in development of staff as well as succession planning. So this is one position to really take all that on, and much of it will be supporting folks, developing it, and helping it move forward. The next item is a lake study, and we did touch on that briefly in context of when we brought the board the discussion of the taste and odor issue and the concept of treatment with ozone. This would be an early effort, certainly far less costly, but less effective than ozone. But given what you've been seeing in these investments and anticipating, even if we wanted to do ozone, it's a number of years off, to look at what can we do with the tools we now have, and bringing further science into how we treat the lakes, when we treat them, where we treat them, thinking about DO issues, dissolved oxygen issues, aeration, all with the focus of trying to, in an in situ way, control taste and odors more effectively than we're doing now, and trying to understand that from a science basis. And then lastly, the watershed recreation plan. Of course, we've been talking about this too, and this is in recognition of the 2 million plus visitors we have to the watershed, and to enhance their experience, to reduce conflicts between different sorts of users, all the while focused on the protection enhancement of the district's biodiversity in context of all these visitors, and put that into a plan, probably something like we've never really done, and we're already starting the scoping of that effort. Next slide. Further levels of investment, valve exercising crew. This first one is reestablishing a program that we had for exercising 15,000 or so system valves with a couple new FTEs. To point out here, one, you need to exercise valves because, and basically when I say exercise, it's not calisthenics necessarily, it's just opening and shutting valves on some frequency, maybe annually or every other year. And if you don't do that, your valves freeze, and essentially you've lost the valve. In addition to the cost of replacing the valve, the more notable impact is when you go out for a main break and try and isolate a system, instead of maybe 2 or 3 customers out of water, you go upstream, maybe it's going to be 20. If those valves don't hold, maybe it's 100. And even a bigger issue in the event of an emergency, when you're trying to take advantage of rerouting water and your system valves don't operate. So it's been about 15 years, I believe, during kind of the lean times. And this is the sort of thing that may never have bubbled up to the board. I just don't know, but that program was abandoned. This next item, SAP, of course, this is our enterprise software that runs everything from HR to finance to customer service to maintenance management is coming to the end of its useful life in terms of support. And we're either going to transition to the next version or move to a different model that may be a better fit for us. But regardless, it's going to be a multi-million-dollar effort, and recommending one FTE to lead this kind of planning and implementation process, and then transitioning into kind of a lead support role that it's an opportunity that we don't really have now. And the third one is sign and trail improvements. And this may slightly overlap with some of the stuff that Sean provided, but may not in terms of what he was talking about capital. But this would be one of the many, many items that would likely come out of the recreation plan in terms of thinking about signage generally, thinking about in context of our sister agencies on the watershed and the like. And then the highest level corrosion control specialist. I thought Director Russell's comments were interesting and in line with this. And if this is really addressing, as we put in more welded steel pipe, replacing pipe that does not have cathodic protection systems in it, the resource need to maintaining, because if you don't maintain these, whether it's induced current or cathodic protection, if you don't maintain, right, you're really not doing yourself a service from the investment you made in putting them in the first place. And the need just goes up to the point, at some point, and it's forecast in X number of years, we're going to need an additional person to that crew. Somewhat similar controls technician, as we've talked about, the SCADA system, which is our remote monitoring and control system, really the heartbeat of our system in terms of how we operate it. The increasing complexity, the increasing reliance of it, and we continue to put more devices out there. So the workload is going up. For example, I just saw staff is going out and putting remote sensors on all of the hatches of our tanks. Just but one more, and it's going to be another 150 data points, another 150 sensors. The benefit certainly is huge, and I'm super supportive of it because it's a security issue. We should know, right, if someone's up on our tank opening the top hatch, so one of our water tanks, just illustratively. The third, lab and field tech staffing, there are, in a way, this one, part of it is linked to the lake study. So depending where that leads us in terms of perhaps increased frequency, we believe it could in terms of treating lakes. We already do have a strained staffing issue we may need to look at. And similarly, the recent regulations are suggesting there's probably a need in our lab for a quality assurance, quality control program that really spells out the need for that for all labs, for probably understandable reasons, to have confidence in the data, to have kind of somewhat of a person independent of the analysis in the lab overseeing. And it's quite a intensive process. So that's something we're thinking about. And then lastly, emergency response. I did note it's on the bubble in terms of our size agency, and we do now have it linked with our safety program, and we have 2 people in safety. That said, we are lagging from where I'd like to see us in terms of developing and kind of operating in terms of doing drills and the like to really be prepared for emergency response. So this is kind of ongoing discussions on this item. So I believe that's it for operating. Be able to take any questions the board may have.
Hi, Ben, this is Larry. A couple of things to think about. I am currently working with XIO folks on a Caltrans facility. That's the internet guys we talked about years ago. They might fit in well to this monitoring of the hatches that you were just talking about. We also work with an outfit called Mission Communications, which uses cell phones to provide the information so you don't have to wire all the data back. They do exactly that kind of thing It's fairly simple, that kind of a one single, open close type of thing. Regarding the lab, you hit on something very interesting. Maybe it's time to rethink the lab too. I don't know exactly what analysis we do, but obviously coliform is one of them. Maybe we should just keep the coliform certification, the ELAP certification for the coliform, and let everything else go, as opposed to having a QA QC. I mean, I don't know if you have familiarity with those things, but they're pretty intensive. They involve a number of samples, spikes and resamples and all that kind of thing. It's every 10 samples has to be a quality control sample, and I don't know that the value's there. I mean, we can still run the GCMS whether we have ELAP certification or not. We get the results. It's not going to change the results. It just changes the paperwork with the state. And I would strongly suggest you talk to the lab manager about the problems with ELAP. It has become a real nightmare these days to stay certified. The coliforms, no issue. We need to stay certified. But anyway, those are just two quick thoughts on that issue.
Good.
So building on that, I was glad that Larry brought up XIO because we did bring them to the district some time ago, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. And, I'm wondering to what extent, Ben, you and the team are thinking about, there's been some time that's gone by, just because we've used a system in the past doesn't necessarily mean that's the way we have to go in the future. And there are more and more of these innovations that, whether they're, especially cloud-based innovations, that at least offer the promise of bringing down operating costs.
I am not familiar specifically with XIO, but with these two comments, I think I'll talk to Paul about bringing, just as an informational item to an upcoming doc, a review of our SCADA and what goes into that and what technologies we're using and how alternative technologies, XIO and others, may fit in. I think it's a good discussion because it is such a critical part of our system.
Yeah.
What it is, Ben, is it's an internet-based
Right.
system. And there were reservations about the security of it with respect to the other parts of SCADA. But one like this is almost so you could turn this over to a burglar alarm company, huh? I mean, that's what you're asking. It's really just, is there a problem or not, huh?
Right. Now, of
as
course,
opposed to looking at it.
I mean, right, Larry, on my example, and it might not have been the best, at a tank site, we probably already have 20 or so signals coming in, including probably some control valves that are controlled. So we're probably tying in the tank hatch already, right, to whatever, I don't know if it's a drop or what we have that consolidates those. And I believe we do use some cellular and do use some hardline, but I just do think it will be beneficial for me as well, but really for the board and public to just hear and understand that technology that we use.
Any other questions for Ben on operating needs and opportunities before we move on to more numbers? Okay, I think Chuck, you are up next.
All right, good morning, directors. So the last few slides here, we will take a look at the actual long-range financial model. We're looking at a horizon of 10 years, as we mentioned. And what this model does is provide us a baseline against which we can analyze the financial implications of the investment scenarios that we land on. And that will further allow us to identify what the gap is between desired service level investment and the resources that we need. So we've developed this in conjunction with Raptelis, and we actually have Steve Gagnon on the call here from Raptelis, who's developed the model. Nancy Fans also helped from Raptelis, and then Nick Young and I have provided input on the district side. So the first thing that we'll look at in any financial model is what the assumptions are that we used in it. So these are just general assumptions. So you can see for general inflation, anything that doesn't fit neatly into those other categories will escalate by 3%, as we will with supplies and utilities. Water production is really that water that we purchase. It's purchased water. We put in a 4% escalator on that. That might be a little bit conservative. Recent years' experience with purchased water shown that it is growing at a rate a little bit higher than that. Salaries, we increased those by 3% for model purposes. And again, we're looking back over our experience and that seems to be about right. We have a floor escalator on salaries, and then we have within that some step increases and other factors that tend to drive that a little above the 2% floor. And then benefits, general benefits, we assumed that those would grow at 5% a year. Again, that seems to be sticking with experience. I should add here, though, anything that we have more accurate inflators for, we use those. So for example, we had talked to the board recently about CalPERS, and CalPERS gives us a 5-year projection of what our rates are going to be. So when we have something more accurate like that, we actually build that into the to that section of the benefits line item. And then another thing that you'll see when I show you the next slide here, which shows the actual projections, is that we actually take down in 22 the water demand. So in the past years, we've talked to the board about our financial experience with water demand. It's gone up, and a portion of that is due to a dry year, and a portion of that is due to COVID. So we thought that going out over the range of this model, it was unrealistic to keep that level of demand within the model. So we kind of took that back to what our normal experience is. So what you can see here, I'll kind of dissect this for you a bit. But generally, you're seeing $104 million in revenues that is servicing $108.5 million of expenses for this current fiscal year. And that looks like you have a deficit of $4.2 million. That really is not a deficit per se. So if you keep in mind that with CMF, we are going pay-go on projects. So as Mike showed you in an earlier slide, we may project that we're going to do $20 million in CIP projects in a year, but we don't complete those and we carry those into the further year. So you can see that over time that bottom line there balances out, and you actually wind up with the cash surplus in fiscal year 2024 going forward. So rate revenues at the top there, that $99.6 million, that is rates from sale of the commodity, CMF, capital maintenance fee, and those other regular fees that we charge to our customers. The next line there is revenue adjustments, and we broke that out so that we could do sensitivity analysis as we go through this process. And what that does is adds the revenue implications of the escalator in our rates. So what you see in the rate adjustment line is a 4% increase assumed to take place this April 1st. And that's why you only have about $1 million in this fiscal year. You've kind of foregone $3 million of that increase as we deferred that. And then you see the implications of the 4% as it kicks in on July 1st and on July 1st of each year. And for purposes of the model, we assumed that 4% rate increase would continue during the forecast horizon of 10 years. Then you see connection charges. We broke those out just because they're a little bit less predictable. We did not feel that they fit in neatly with rate revenues. Other operating revenues there, you can see we broke those out too. And those are things that don't really fit in with the rates. Things like late payment charges, special read charges, watershed daily parking permits, and things like that are what go into those other operating revenues. Investment income is just what we make on the portfolio, and we kind of looking out at that. We think that in the next year we're going to make about 0.6%, which is really kind of mirroring our experience with LAIF right now. And then that will bump up to 1% as investment returns normalize in 2023. And then other income, again, were just things that don't fit in neatly. And primarily what other income is rental from property we have and rental from watershed assets. Primarily makes up that $1.6 million. And then on the expenditure side, we lumped all the operating expenses together, and that's everything from salaries to O&M. One-time capital expenses were things like survey equipment and lab equipment that we purchased. So we only made an assumption for what's budgeted in 2021. And then your debt service line, that's our existing debt service. You can see the fiscal year 2023, that drops down And that drop there is due to the refunding that we did of that 2012 bond. So our debt service drops out in 2023. And then finally, you see funded capital projects, rate funded capital projects funded by CMF, fire flow fees. And that there in those first years matches up with the budget. And then we marry up what the long range 10-year CIP plan is after 2023. So that's what's giving you your bottom line net cash surplus and deficiency that you see there. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see that we've spelled this out graphically. So what you see here in the top, that $104 million that you see in fiscal year 2021, the box, those are your revenues. And then beneath that, you see those rate funded capital projects, $21.7 million in the first year. Beneath that, that gray box of debt service, you can see that's stable over the life of the, horizon of the forecast. And then you see O&M expenses in that kind of aqua box below that. And then at the bottom in green, you can see where we are taking net cash for those CIP projects in the first few years where you saw that deficit. That's where that draws from. And then give me one more slide, please. So finally, we also took a look at what our fund balances and our reserves will look like over the next several years. So at the end of this year, you can see in that box above is $49 million. And that includes a couple of things. We talked to the board about the unrestricted, undesignated fund balance, which is really our reserve, and that the target there is for 6 months. As of our last financial report, we're a little over 4 months in reserves. It also includes CIP fund balance in there. And then we've got the rate stabilization in there of $9.4 million. So that's what makes up your $49 million in fund balance. And you can see how that fund balance fluctuates over the life of the forecast over those 10 years. And then above there, you see a gray line. And what that gray line represents is if we actually hit our 6-month reserve target, our policy reserve target, that would bump up those reserves to that line. And again, though, that would take resources that will probably have to come from some other place to bump up that reserve or to bump up any reserves. Next slide, please. Okay, and that's what we have for the forecast. We'll be glad to take any questions.
Chuck, that was really helpful. I don't have questions, but I do want to let you know, because I know this conversation is going to go on, that I have a hard stop at 11:30, just a commitment I could not change. So if I wink out, it's not that I'm not interested, but this was really, really helpful and well put together. Thank you.
And Chuck's presentation was the last slide, as he said, presentation. So definitely want to hear any questions for him.
I have a question, Chuck. I mean, it's fine to have the gray line as a goal. What's the plan to get to the goal for the reserves?
Well, that's going to be part of the prioritization that we do with the stakeholders. You know, in order to get to that line, that may mean that we forego some other things. It depends on where that comes out in the prioritization.
And what's the rationalization for the gray line? What is the
gray line was put in there because under the board policy, we actually have a reserve target for that of 6 months. To my knowledge, I'm not sure we've ever hit it, but we're pretty steadily moving towards it.
No, they have hit it, I believe, in the past, but yeah. Okay, that probably should be stated on this graph because it makes it a little easier for people to understand. I think the other thing missing from this graph is what are we doing about pensions?
Mm-hmm.
Pension reserve, you know, I think that one justifies being on here too, huh?
Yeah, and that the pension reserve is actually part of that $49 million, also that $2 million in reserves there. But yeah, that is a much larger discussion.
Oh, no question. But I think even if it's just a to be determined line or a point on the left side of the abscissa, I think it needs to be there to say something about pension reserves, you know, just because it is a significant issue potentially.
What do we mean by minimum reserve? What's the definition of the minimum reserve?
So the minimum reserve we built in, we assumed that we were hitting 25% of O&M. So 3 months in reserves.
So it's sort of a sub-target.
Kind of a sub-target. Yes, Director.
Is there an industry standard?
There are several industry standards, and we kind of purposely took out the discussion of reserves for this to do it another meeting because it gets a little more involved. Yeah, it depends on who you look at. So American Water Works Association, I think their target was 3 months if memory serves. And then if you look at Government Finance Officers Association, they recommend 45 days of operating reserves, which I think is kind of low. But the reason we kind of peeled that discussion out for another meeting is there is no standard answer because it really relies on what the makeup is of your agency. So if you have exposure to highly volatile revenue sources, you're probably going to want to increase those levels of reserves. Whereas if you have a very fixed revenue source and you have less financial risk, then you can lower those reserves. So there's really not a one size fits all. You kind of have to size this based on what your risk profile is.
Yeah, can everyone hear me or am I garbled?
We can hear you, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to paraphrase what Chuck just said, just a little bit shorter, is in practice, I see that if agencies bill monthly, it's pretty common to have 25% of O&M as your operating reserve target alone. If they bill bi-monthly, then they go to 6 months of O&M. But it does vary. Every agency is not the same. I just wanted to say that those are pretty common. And lastly, you may have already picked this up, but I'll just summarize it. The takeaway from this graph is that if you were, and I know we're going to be discussing this, okay, but we just wanted to paint the picture that if you were to do status quo right now, as it was presented to you today, and you had these reserve goals, the minimum being the dark and the max being the gray, you can see with 4% revenue increases, your reserve balances aren't quite meeting the minimum reserve target. So even with 4% increases every year and you do status quo, you're not quite there yet. We just wanted to that's the major takeaway from this slide.
Steve, that's very helpful. That is not obvious from the graph. I did not read that out of the graph. I thought it implied we were meeting the minimum reserve with the black line. What you're saying is the blue line has to touch the black line
what
to
I'm
be
saying
the minimum
is,
reserve.
Yeah, what I'm saying is your blue bars, the turquoise
Yes.
bars have to touch the bottom dark line in order to meet
The
your
black
minimum
line, yeah.
reserve. The black line, yes. And you're not quite there. You're almost
I don't
there.
think that, right, that didn't come across in Chuck's presentation, though.
Okay, well, I just
At least
wanted to.
I didn't pick it up.
Okay.
So this has been, oh, Monty, I'm sorry.
I was going to just clarify that this financial assessment we're looking at right now assumes the status quo. Is that correct?
Correct.
So any selection of A or B or C or C, B, and A, to do it another way, would affect the outcome of our reserve. Okay.
Yes.
That's very helpful.
Well,
without some sort of other way of increasing rates or increasing revenue, I should say.
Or debt.
Right. And I think, Chuck, if you could go back to the prior slide, I mean, or who's ever doing the slides, this similarly, right, from a budget standpoint, the revenues are assuming, just continuing for the sake of the model, 4%. So essentially it suggests that 4% is what you need to generally, aside from the slight dips in reserves, to generally maintain status quo. And as Monty noted, increased levels of investment would take 4% plus X as we get into those discussions. Or, to be fair, cost cutting, right? That's the other way of reducing costs somewhere to reprioritize and bring in, that's always a fair place to think and discussion. This organization, this agency, I think in part based on the history of some lean times, like we talked about in terms of the valve exercising crew, there's not many identifiable opportunities to reduce costs and replace those with other initiatives.
And just to give you
You
a
know,
little
Ben,
more,
let me just pop in here for a second. It's very interesting you mentioned the valve exercising. That turned out to be one of the biggest issues in the water quality fiasco in Flint, was two things. They didn't even know which valves were open or closed. They had stopped exercising a long time ago as a cost-cutting measure. And guess what? When they went to exercise them, they wouldn't move. So what was a 1 hour job now is an excavation plus a major shutoff to get to the valve, to fix the valve so that you can shut the water off, you know. So those are things I think you really need to pitch to the board to make sure there's a clear understanding of the value. You know, you did say something, valve exercising, you know, I mean, that means turning them on and off, guys. You know, I don't think they even know what that means. Okay, they might, and hopefully they do, but I doubt Monty does in particular. He probably never heard that term, valve exercising. And so I would suggest really pounding on the routine maintenance, because as I said, in Flint, that turned out to be a major issue, the fact that they had stopped exercising the valves.
Absolutely.
So just a couple questions and observations. On the cost of capital, I noticed that's 4% in a Chuck's scenario. That seems pretty high considering current costs of capital. And I'm just wondering, and I brought this up before, and I know we're locked in until whenever 2023 before we could even consider it, but we're spending about 10 million a year just on the cost of capital, on whether we should start thinking about some kind of strategic planning to, you know, reduce our cost of capital, because, you know, A, it's going to decrease our costs. B, you know, we can leverage our current revenues more effectively. So it's just something, I know we're kind of not there yet, but, you know, if things kind of stay where they are, I think the cost of capitals should go down or should stay below that 4%.
So Director Bragman, if I can just interject, I think what you're looking at was the assumption slide with the capital at 4%.
Right.
That'd be slide 69. There you go. That's actually a reference to the escalator in capital projects.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see. Expense inflation. I got you. Okay. So, but still, my point is, and I've talked to you before about it, about whether we can at some point extract ourselves from our current bond obligations, which I know is that horizon is a few years off, but that could save us substantial amount of money. And the other thing, just, and it's pretty trivial compared to the rest of the budget, on the other revenue stream, you've kept it constant, and we did have a recent discussion about renegotiating some of our, right there, other income, renegotiating some of our cell tower leases, which are below market rate. So, you know, that could, you know, increase, you know, maybe by half, which, you know, given the amounts of money we're talking about is trivial, but, you know, I think it's just something to put into our calculations. So.
It's a good point. And there's also the major building lease that we get rental income from that we're negotiating.
Right.
The timing of an increase that may not be in here. Those are good points.
You know, and just, I'm just going to throw one other kind of weird one out is California has passed legislation for formation of a public bank. And it's something Chuck, we need to keep an eye on that, because that may present some opportunities for us to get out of the private equity market and get into, we'll see what the Bank of California can do, the State Bank of California can do.
The North Dakota model.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully not run by CalPERS.
No, but North Dakota's done very, very well with it, and has reduced the cost of capital for its public agencies.
So there's like a super bonding agency. Is that what they do? They borrow them.
It's
money on the open
literally,
market and then reloan it.
It's literally a bank. It's literally a public bank. So it's, so you're cutting out, bonuses, you're cutting out the, kind of the inequitable fees and a few of the other things.
Sure.
And it reduces the cost.
The profit. Well, the profit, right? I mean, right off the top.
Essentially, I don't want to be accused of being a socialist, but let's just call it, it's a public bank. It's a municipal bank.
Cool.
So as we're moving forward here, I have a question I thought I'd throw out to the board just to see if we could get a little discussion before we wrap up and finish. And that is, now that you've seen probably a holistic look at the water system as a whole, both capital and operating, what priorities are emerging in your minds when you look at this? What do you want to make sure that when we come back with scenarios at this next workshop that we have really captured for you?
I'll start. I'll just throw out the three that stick in my mind. The North Marin line, which seems to be really critical infrastructure. The pump stations, which also seem to be critical infrastructure. Failure is stoppage. And I had fire, fire protection, some kind of fire strategy, including maybe getting a new piece of equipment. The equipment I saw are two fire trucks, like the Tonka trucks I played with when I was a kid. I mean, they're cool, but they're about 3 or 4 generations behind. So,
well, those are from the Jack Gibson Museum of Fire Trucks.
I'll jump in there because I know we're short on time and just say I would echo particularly the last one, fire protection. I think that really understanding how we get the BFFIP up to where the projections, I think, matter on a lot of different levels. Something else that the way this has been presented is very informative, but my basic mind that's trying to come up to speed on a lot of issues for the district is almost very basic of like, are we catching up to where our maintenance should be, or are we closing the gap, or is the status quo, or is something of a status quo is just holding the same level of deficit? It's hard to tell whether a CB or an A is maintaining the same deficit if there is one, or whether it's closing the gap and where it's going to lead us. So in some ways, I feel like these alternatives would be helpful if they could really tell us. It's almost like how well are we leaving the system in better shape at 10 years than where we are now, or will it be in the same shape, if that makes sense?
That's an excellent question, Monty. That's an excellent question.
So
your question is justified based on the presentation because it's difficult to understand that. I think, and I forget which way they are. Which is the most expensive, 1A or 1C? Do we know? Anybody know?
Yes. So A is higher level of investment.
1A would catch it. 1A would catch us up, as I understand it. The most expensive one would catch us up to where we need to be.
Well, yes, generally, and I'd say status quo for the most part in the hard asset classes is we're losing ground. But we'll refine that response far better at the next workshop.
I just want to finish by saying, you know, I just think that when it comes to, maybe I'm a somewhat of a litmus test for how the public might see, an informed public might see this, which is it's hard to tell what these priorities are because, you know, this is very complicated stuff. And I don't mean to in any way cast doubt on the staff's great thinking that's gone into this, but there, you know, I think the public will be probably more easily help to understand the trade-offs and especially the costs if they're understanding like this is your house. You're either if there's a certain amount of maintenance you have got to do so that your house, that investment is maintained, or you already had a deficit of you already got behind on your paint and your paint's peeling off. You know you're going to have a big problem if you don't deal with it. That's deferred maintenance that needs to be caught up. I think explaining it in terms like that will help people understand. And I think they would be supportive of knowing that 10 years from now, we will be better off than where we are today. I think generally we all want to think that that's where 10 years from now we will be. And they can, if they understand what it takes to do that, I think they'll be more supportive because they'll understand the concept.
Be a little careful, Monty, because you got to think of this like the inchworm. You know, he's moving forward, but he's moving backwards at the same time. So while 10 years from now, you fix the problems of today, now you have new problems 10 years later. So things are 10 years older. You know, so it's a dynamic situation. It's not just you fix it and you're done. Yeah. That's true for that problem in the rear view, but the problem in the windshield is still coming.
Yes. I know that there's ongoing I know that the life that there's been complicated analyses that are showing us that we will have, 10 years from now, what is good today will have a maintenance need. I'm speaking of a comprehensive vision that takes into account that is shifting. 10 years from now, we will have ongoing and always will have ongoing needs.
It's the Golden Gate Bridge painting analogy that somebody made earlier.
Yes.
As far as the prioritization that was asked for here, I put wildfire top of the list, and there's nothing else that goes on that same list. The others all fall into a category where we have to decide. The other thing I would give a priority to for the process is I think it's urgent that we be able to attach water rate numbers to these big numbers we're looking at. How does it translate to the dollars that people have to put on the check?
Mm-hmm.
Well, anything else on that question about what we need to make sure we bring back to you in these scenarios in workshop 2?
Yeah, I've got a few more things. I have great confidence in Mike Bond and his group in terms of determining the prioritization, and Ben, the whole gang. I just think the issue is we need to really raise our eyes off of the ground and look up about where we're going and how to get there. You know, we have a plan, and like I said, I'm very comfortable with their prioritization, with the one exception being that, maybe we need to remove all the cast iron pipe now, or remove all the steel tanks now, or paint all the steel tanks now, or remove all the redwood tanks now. Get away from this, well, we can afford to do 1 or 2 a year, kind of say, we need to do 6 this year. And I think Ben has got his arms around that. And so I'm pretty happy with that end of it. And I know it's a lot to take in, Monty, and you are an excellent reflector for the public, okay? Because it's coming at you full board, just as it did to Larry Bragman, and less in my case, because I live in this business, but it is a really big task to start pulling all this in to your mind. But your questions are very good and right on the way of thinking. We just need to make sure, and I think we should probably use Monty as the sounding board, that if we're not getting it across to Monty, who's fairly well immersed in it, then we're probably not doing a good job at all to the public, because it just goes right over their head more than likely, because it's just too much information.
Good point.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know.
And Jack, one question I have for Jack. I'm not sure what you mean by wildfire prioritization. I agree with you that in the concept, I'm not sure what it means and how to put it into mechanical figures. You know, are we talking about the interface? Are we talking about widening roads to get the fire trucks up there? Or are we talking about ensuring that people cut the bushes back from their houses? You know, the thing that struck me the most, which Larry Bragman pointed out quite clearly, was that the houses are more a risk to the watershed than the watershed is a risk to the houses. And that's something we need to really think through about how we're approaching that. Maybe even to the point of helping people remove the excess brush around their homes to try to buy future time. You know, there's just a lot of issues.
I think
and
that's
one
right.
thing I would like to say too, Ben, while we're, go ahead, Jack, go ahead.
Sean has a plan, you know, and what we're hearing is an incremental progress on what I consider to be an extremely important plan. So all of the above in the list of challenges you mentioned, all of those things we should be doing. And I say that based on that's what Sean is saying. But the fact that we're sitting here today with unmet needs on the issue of wildfires is a little bit scary, you know.
Couldn't agree more, Jack. Couldn't agree more.
We want that off the to-do list.
That may be another
Yes,
goal.
and in fact, that's an excellent way of putting it, Jack. That is exactly what I've been trying to say, is instead of this incremental scratching the items off, we need to think of them in quantums or in groups and attack a group so that, you know, I have a feeling, and I could be completely wrong, that the watershed could absorb as much money as we're willing to pay to address this issue, because I think it's basically a very difficult issue to manage. I think you can help, but I don't think you can really do too much in terms of the big picture. We can't control lightning strikes. We can't control, you know, how the state responds, or you know, getting in the air tankers here to do spray of borax or whatever they do. You know, once the fire starts, we're kind of cooking, and from there,
An example with not wanting to get into the weeds here, but Sonoma Water apparently has a state-of-the-art video system that is up on their watershed that heads off an early alert to wildfires. I've heard us talking about such a thing, but if there is such a thing, we should have it. We shouldn't be talking about it.
I think we do have it.
We have some level, but
I thought they had installed those.
What I was told is that their level is in the extreme, and you know we're not there yet. So I don't know. I mean, but
gotcha, Jack.
But if there is such a thing, we need it.
We'll bring back the answer specifically on that. I mean, all these, but I wanted to know on that particular.
We do have some video surveillance programs.
We do.
And
with the infrared and all that.
Yeah.
But let us understand it in detail and bring it back.
Yeah,
I think we all agree. We do need to understand and address some deficiencies if they exist.
Yeah.
Well, your answers to that last question were very helpful in us framing for workshop number 2. That concludes this portion of the workshop. I'm not sure which board member I'm supposed to turn this back to for your agenda. Since
well, I have a question, Melissa, before you.
Larry, he's the vice president.
If anybody, Melissa, do you see a potential for the format that I proposed, which was to have some kind of a Q&A on the first workshop and the second workshop? Do you kind of envision a way that might happen, or you think that's going to just throw a block in the road?
No, I absolutely. The interest is to include more public comment, both within these workshops and then in other opportunities, as Jeannie mentioned at the beginning. So we'll definitely take that into consideration and see what we can do to accomplish that.
It could even start before the regular workshop, you know. or on a different day for that matter. It could be
Yeah, no, I took
scheduled so that it's.
as something to incorporate. Mhm.
I just want to make sure the thinking is engaging. Thank you
You
for
bet, we
having that
got it.
answer.
Okay, I'm turning it back over to, I'm not sure which.
That would be Larry,
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Vice President.
I got you. So I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, Ben. I haven't really put on the crown yet.
Vice President Russell, you should ask for if there's any last public comments. And
Public
before
comment.
you
Okay,
adjourn.
that's easy one. Thank you, Terry. Is there?
Okay. Yes, I have Larry Menike.
Is there any? Okay.
Go
Why
ahead.
not?
Have at it,
I'll
Larry.
jump in here so you know someone's been watching. What I'm coming away with is, and I may have misunderstood this, that 1A was going to be really about infrastructure. 1B was going to focus a little bit more on the wildfire and the watershed. And I feel like there should have been more granular detail on watershed, that the focus, and rightly so, is on infrastructure. Infrastructure is an enormous cost there. But really would like to see much more detail on going forward on what needs to be done on the watershed. And as all of you were just talking about is wildfire protection. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I can personally assure you that will happen. Your comment is a good one. Remember that this boat is being driven by engineers, and we tend to think about pipes and pumps and things like that, tanks. That's kind of where our mind is. So, we will get it broadened out to address it, because as you and Jack have, and Larry Bragman have correctly said, and Monty, the real issue is if we lose control of the watershed, the rest becomes a little insignificant. It's like we may have the best pumps in the world, but if we have no watershed, or we burn all the houses down because of the watershed, that's not going to help us very much. So
Right.
heard you well and loud and clear, and thank you for the comment.
And if I may just add one comment to that, is home hardening, helping people with home hardening was mentioned. And if I may suggest to speak with Rich Shortall at Fire Safe Marin, that's what they're doing. And that would be a place where the district and Fire Safe Marin could actually work quite closely together, I think. Of course, I cannot speak for Rich, but I would encourage you to speak with Fire Safe Marin about the home hardening issue. Thank you.
This MWPA, Larry, is that something we are participating? I heard you say we weren't a member, and that's fine. But is it something we should attend the meetings, or are we already attending the meetings?
I don't think you're attending the meetings. You've got the advisory technical committee. You've got the operations committee, which would be the most interesting to the board. There's certainly crossover. It would be good for someone to be sitting in on some of this and understand where the MWPA is, just so that we're all connected in some way, that we all know what the others are doing. In fact, I reported the previous meeting back to Mark Brown, who is the chief executive officer, so that he had a sense of what's going on here, because there's a complete disconnect right now. I can say that.
Larry, we have tried. Okay. We have tried to coordinate with Rich on grazing, and we had a little bit of an interface 2 years ago up at Smith Saddle, which were the big tanks that we were talking about recoding. And what we tried to do was coordinate on the grazing. So, my vision has always been that we need to create sort of a belt of grazed land, because we know the more you graze, the more efficient it becomes, because the animals just move through the area more quickly. So I do think, coordinating in that regard would be very, very helpful for the community. And
maybe we can borrow those elk, Larry, from West Marin.
We've looked into it. They won't give them to us. They won't let them go. Yeah, it's too bad, because they're going to get culled.
I'll jump in very quickly and just say we are intimately involved with Fire Safe Marin. We have a board seat. We participate in discussions and are ongoing. We encourage them ongoingly to focus on residents and communities around the watershed. But as we all know, wildfire is important throughout the county. And so their resources are somewhat limited to how much they can carry out and complete. But we are continuing those conversations and trying to get a focus on home hardening in areas adjacent to all open space district lands and watershed lands throughout the county. And then in regards to the MWPA, we have met with the directors of that organization to discuss opportunities for collaboration, really with a focus on helping their inspectors evaluate homes that are adjacent to the watershed, as well as homes that are adjacent to our water infrastructure, whether it be a pump station or a tank site. So those discussions are ongoing, and we do engage in the meetings. We haven't gone to the community oversight committee meeting. We did apply to be on it, but we were not selected as an organization. And we're staying tuned into that conversation though, and we'll continue to.
That's interesting with only 20,000 acres of land, but that's a story for a different day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sean.
We have one more. We have one more public comment.
We'll get to that in a minute. I
Okay.
just want to do something before I forget. Jeannie, I really like the closed captioning, and I think it's an excellent addition. I think it should be in all of our meetings. It seems to be working very well. It's a little raggedy sometimes, but it kind of gets there. I'd say it's running at 90% plus accuracy, maybe higher.
Great. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Terry. Go ahead.
Great.
Oh, okay. Paul Primo.
Yes.
Paul.
Hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Oh, good. First of all, congratulations. I thought it was a very, very thorough effort and a good starting point for further modifications and understandings. Director Gibson, towards the end, stated an important priority, which I personally and Citizens for Sensible Taxation are concerned about, of course, and that is the rates and how they are designed ultimately, and the role of debt financing and your capability and capacity to fund any or all of these various elements, these various CB&A with debt are an important consideration, which I presume Raftellus will emphasize and prioritize. The rate impacts of, for example, just the capital scenario A, if I remember, $400 million of cumulative investment, I guess at today's dollars, over an undefined duration of time. In other words, can you have the capacity to fund any of these scenarios or modifications thereof, CB&A, which reflect a 10-year program, but to fund it with debt over, let's say, a 20 or 25-year period, which of course we all know incurs an interest cost, but so does inflation modify the then payment of interest in the dollars then versus the dollars in a pay-go approach. I don't know if that makes sense. Someone mentioned, I guess maybe Chuck McBride, that you have a debt obstacle, an increase in debt obstacle through 2023. I think it was Larry Bregman. I think that ought to be explored. The cost of earlier violation of that, whatever it takes to get the flexibility to issue debt for, let's say, a 20 or 25-year period of time at your very good credit rating, is something that the ratepayers might greatly favor over the concept of paying 100% of it right away. I've looked at some of the Raftellis's studies for other water districts, and the ratios that are important as they present them ultimately is the ratio or percentage, if you will, of debt financing to total financing for capital programs. And the ones I remember are in the 70 to 90% debt financing. So when you get to the point later on in these workshops and you finalize this program, the focus on debt versus ratepayer pay as you go approach will be terribly important. because
Mr.
obviously-
Primo, I'm sorry, your 3 minutes is up, sir.
All right, that's fine. Thank you. I'll supplement this with a written communication, and I am speaking on my personal behalf, not for the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers, who may or may not agree with what I'm saying, but I believe they will, but I can't speak for them today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Paul.
I have no further questions or comments.
Okay, with that, I think we're done, Ben. So I think it's a great job. I think Melissa did a great job. Jeannie did a great job. Mike and his group, the presenters. I'm very pleased with where we are, and I'm very pleased we're moving forward to putting a plan together to address our finances going into the future. And Paul, we will address the rate issues as time goes on. They're foremost in our minds as well.
We've really appreciated the engagement. I mean, this was a long 3 hours of the board in the feedback and direction you gave for subsequent workshops. So thank you all for that.
And thank you, Ben, for sending us the slides ahead of time too. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know that there's any official action here. Just I think we can terminate.
Adjournment.
Adjourn.
Thank you, folks.
That's
Cool,
the-
adjourned.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks all.
See ya.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.